So we can get started. Good afternoon. And so we continue with, and look at one of the last systems in terms of like deployments and stuff like that. And it's kind of bothersome. This paper was not supposed to talk about acoustics measurements, but they actually did more than the last paper, which was actually published after this paper, but it didn't talk about this one. They were both published in good conferences. This was published in SenSys, and that was published in Mobicon. Those are both like first-year conferences, but it's kind of weird, right? So before we go in, administrative issues. Next Tuesday I'll be gone, and the DA will proctor the exam here. It'll be in-class exam, sort of open-ended, like the homework assignment, and you have an hour and 15 minutes, and open work, open notes. People are taking course before open work, open notes. You're not allowed to search anything on the internet. Some of you mentioned that you're going to be out of town too. So if you're, including Nathan, who will be out of town with me. So if you're out of town, let me know, and you can take it. Take home exam kind of stuff, right? You don't necessarily have to come here if you're going to be out of town. So the topics will be whatever we covered till today. So it'll include all the textbook and the different deployments we looked at, right? If you have any questions, let me know. I should have email access till Sunday or so, right? So this is the sort of the last of the genre kind of thing. So they're trying to do the underwater again, right? So, and this is published in SenSys, and of the so it's a set of people who work in MIT and in Australia. The third author, Daniela Rus, I think she's the faculty in charge from the MIT perspective. She's a robotics person, right? So she builds robotics for a living. So Amor, one of the robots they use, is part of, it's their main contribution. So that's where they come from. And the other two sensors come from the Australian component, the Starbus and the Aquaflux, right? We'll see what they are, but that tells you what their contributions and where they're focusing their energy on. And the nice thing about this paper is it had experimental results on some of the things we looked at last class. And last class talks about like if you're doing underwater, the networks is awful and all those things, but this gives you actually more figures, including cost figures on how bad these things are. It introduces a notion of mobility, and we'll see we'll think about how this maps to the ZebraNet we looked at before in the terrestrial sense. And so the new thing is the data, the optical way of communication and what they call data muling, right? We haven't talked so much about that in the different stuff. It's more of a military kind of thing. Data muling is one of the things that people talk about, where you fly something on top. In this case, you let something swim over your sensors. So you deploy all these sensors, and then you fly an aircraft slowly over the battlefield, and it collects all the information, right? So in that sense, you don't have to send the information off to a central base node. So you don't have to worry about how to route it. Basically, the router comes to you, you upload the contents. And in this sense, they use that to also synchronize the clock. The clock is not synchronized till something flies over you, and then you do communication. So you trust the one which is flying over you, has a lot of energy, it has a good clock and everything, and it does the work for the other one, right? And it makes sense in a battlefield scenario, because then you can kind of fly these aircraft in a zigzag pattern. It makes a lot more sense in underwater, and that's what these authors are claiming, right? So they introduced the main thing to take away is the optical underwater and the data muling component, right? So first we look at the different components, different sensors that they use, because that drives what they can do, right? Essentially, they're trying to monitor reefs. Being in Australia, I guess they wanted to look at the coral reefs, the health of them. So they want to put these sensors into the coral reef, which can measure temperature, pressure, and all those things, and also take pictures of the health of coral reefs, and have the data taken out of the sensors. And since these are shallow water sensing, you assume that there's enough light for you. You don't have to worry about lighting, so you're not worried about underwater. And It also lets them get away from not worrying about 3D effects, right? Because if you're monitoring something which is like a few meters or tens of meters deep, you're not worried about the effects of depth. You're not worried about. So remember, one of the things we talked about in the last class was if you have the ocean surface here and the floor here, right? If this happens to be very small, you can probably have one sensor here and approximate what the feelings are, right? But in real, if you're going to deep water, then you're likely to have many of these kind of strung together. So you can measure every so many feet. So you're trying to talk about a 3D kind of sensing. And in this setup, there is no 3D sensing because it's not deep enough, right? And we'll think about how it will change something that we looked at before. So the first component they have is the aqua flux, right? It's built on flux processor, which came from the Australian component side of the research. There's not much research, not much data on what happened to this sensor on their web pages, right? So there's a lot more stuff on the Amor one, not this one. So essentially, it runs their own flux processor, and it has like a half a kilobyte of flash to store the contents, hence the title storage component, right? And they outfitted that with two optical sensors, with optical and acoustic sensing, right? Optical sensing gives it either 2.2 meter range or 8 meter range. So if you want to do 8 meter range, you essentially have to have a lens which focuses the image. So the idea here is if they send the optical information sort of at a wider angle, then you reach 2.2 meter, right? If you send it on a very narrow beam, then you can go up to 8 meter, right? The catch is if it is over here, then reading this is easier because you can potentially be anywhere from here to here and be able to read the contents. If you're doing it narrow, then it's a lot more targeted at a single location. So that's the stuff. So they can either fit it with the lens, so they can read it at further out or closer and get the readings. The network is much faster than what we were looking at before, right? It can do 320 kilobits per second, which approaches sort of like a useful kind of thing. So that's fast enough for you to send the camera. If you had a camera and if you want to send a video, 320 kbps is sort of like your slow DSL kind of stuff. So this is fast enough for you to send the data. And as we'll see, this is not necessarily as good because of the distance range, right? So it has a processor. It can store some of these contents. It has these traditional sensors you would imagine. It also has an acoustic module, which is sort of similar to what the Ian, the Georgia Tech folks were working on, right? So it could either use both of these for communication. For the experiments, they use this for ranging to see how far other sensors are. And we'll see a little bit more of details in subsequent slides. So essentially, this one can range and figure out where the other sensors are. It can communicate with somebody through optical, right? And it also has camera sensors which can take pictures. And because the storage is so little, it can only do half a kilobyte. The only thing they implemented was if you want to take a picture, somebody has to send a command, and whatever image is transmitted directly out, right? So it cannot be stored. So if you want to take a picture, you have to go near the device and say, take a picture and send the picture over to me, which pretty much means that, as we'll see, the component which flies over it would be the one which, so you take a picture basically of the one which is taking the data away from you. You can't do real life stuff, right? But that's the limitation of the storage, and that's nothing to do with this group. I mean, that's the Australian group, right? I don't think they were focusing on that yet. I mean, they're more worried about the ranging and how far you can communicate and all those components. So it's not ROD, sorry, it's ROD. The weird part is so they build this using 40 negatively buoyant, right? Which essentially means that whenever you drop it in the water, it flips straight and it points up, right? So however you deploy it, so this is like a little box here with a sticking thing sticking out. So it always floats like this, right? So even if you flip it, it'll go back up. And that's what the 40 negatively buoyant does, right? So they have this little like thing sticking out at the top with the LED here, which can be used to figure out where they are. And it's colored bright yellow, so you can figure out where they are. And we'll see what those are translate to. But essentially, this is how you can deploy those. So you have this like handle, and you can kind of grab it by the handle and drop it wherever you want, right? And you can move it, and you can use it for that kind of purposes. So this one has this handle, right? So that's the station sensor. So you have these things, you put these sensors throughout the field you're looking at, and I think they had like 10 of those. You put them in the coral reefs, and by the effect of this, the way they designed it, it'll always float up like this, right? And you have the optical sensors, optical communication basically trying to shoot up, right? And you have them floating around the field, right? And now you have to build a mobile component which will actually go and collect the information, right? So there are two mobile components that these people use. One is Amor, which comes from MIT. The other one is the Starbug, which we'll see next. Amor is this, it's fairly large thing. I don't know if you can see it, but you see this person's hand right here, right? This is a swimmer with a hand right here. So this looks sort of as big as something like this, right? So you have this fairly large platform, right? At the bottom, it has the corresponding other end to latch onto this and take it, right? So this can deploy these aquaflux by latching onto here and then dragging it wherever they want to, right? So these ones deploy these sensors, right? And it has 4 thrusters. You may be able to see 2 fans up here. There's one red and one green, right? There's a green fan here and a red fan here. And there are 2 fans which lift it, right? And these 2 fans, one of them rotates. So essentially, it can rotate on itself, right? Basically, turning off one of the fans and then moving one, right? Or it can move forward with these 2 fans, right? So this one always floats like this. It doesn't like flip over kind of thing. It floats like this. It can go up and down and hover. Basically, we'll see how it hovers. Basically, it can stay at one location with reasonable accuracy. It can connect to one of these things and then move them around. It can also measure data, and we'll see how that happens. But it can move around based on these motors, right? It can't see too far. It doesn't have a notion of it can't see really, right? All it has is a magnetic compass. So it can know from where it is. It can know where magnetically it can go. So it can't see where it is. So this one, if you drop it on the ground, so you can use magnetism to control where it goes, right?
Doesn't have GPS, too.
It's not clear. I think it does, but it could be the Starbug. They kind of like keep going back and forth on precisely what it does, right? Because I think it does, but I don't know if it can actually dive in, right? And we'll see how that affects in a little bit. But essentially, you have like one of these AUVs have a GPS, right? And it knows where it is by coming out of the water, right? But this one doesn't look like it can actually go out of the water, right? And they say some of this stuff will be on the next paper, and I couldn't find any paper on what they did with whatever, right? So it may or may not have a GPS, but we know it has a compass, right? And it uses. So it has the communications on the bottom. So if this was on the top, right, it can do the communications with the other ones through the bottom, right? So the optical communication will happen through the bottom, right? So the idea here would be you have this aquaflux on the ground, and somehow the Amor would come on top of it, align itself, right? And then kind of hover, and you'll do some kind of communication between these two, and then it'll move on to something else, right? And if it wants, it can take the sensor off and then go elsewhere, right? And I think some of the graphs, some of the videos actually show that how you would take this stuff and then moving the stuff, right? And this is a robotics group, so they actually like the fact you can move this stuff. From the sensing perspective, we don't particularly care about this big rod, but from a robotics perspective, it's an interesting component, right? Yeah, a lot of these things, they kind of go back and forth on what precisely is on each of those platforms, because the GPS, they look like it's here, but I don't think it's here. I think GPS is on this platform, right, which is the Starbug, which comes from Australian group, not from their group, right? So this is apparently a more conventional platform. It's fairly long. I think it's like 1.2 meters, so it's like almost as long as a person. It has 6 thrusters, right? 6 fans, so it can go anywhere it wants. So basically, it can go forward, it can go sideways and up and everything. But the way it's driven, it's meant to go further out because it's streamlined to go further out, right? It cannot change and hover as easily as the other, seems like the Amor platform. It's a more realistic platform if you want it to go too far. So if you read between the lines, it seems like you would want to have these on the ground and the Amor kind of scouring these fields, moving slowly, and then the Starbug would come over and then collect the data from the Amor to the Starbug and then go away to the human user, right? Because I don't think Amor is designed to go for kilometers worth of distance. And these things are not designed, are not as good to stay, hover at one location, do this stuff, and then kind of move over kind of thing, right? So these things kind of work together. But they say how to get the information from the Amor to this one is after the next paper, right? So they built these different kind of platforms to do the different tasks, and so this stuff so they can be deployed over here, and then from here on to here, you somehow get the data out. And this is from a different project and looks like, so they're more worried about, so this one has cameras that are fitted on the front and the bottom, so you can actually know where it's going. It does not have to depend on the magnetometer, though it has one, right? So it can actually see, so it can actually come over and it can potentially know where these things are. These are bright yellow colored, so it can actually see where these things are. It can look forward, right? So it can actually see where it's going, which the Amor cannot do, because Amor does not have anything to view. So ideally what you would like, so if you want to move the Amor from one area to another area, you'll have to have the Starbug come over and pull the Amor and move it around, because Amor cannot see, this one can see, kind of stuff. So eventually you'll have this integrated platform where there are static sensors and different mobile sensors which do different concepts, right? One is optimized more for hovering and reading data and moving stuff around. The other one is more for long duration travel kind of things. And the key is they built all this stuff and they actually tried it on 3 different components. One is the swimming pool, Olympic-sized swimming pool, which is one of the things that I was wondering last class. Very few people actually done anything. So they actually did it on the swimming pool. And they also did it on Charles River, right? Which they can only see like a 1 meter further out. So, I mean, the Charles River in Boston is not exactly clean. So you can only see 1 meter. So regardless of what you do, the water is so bad, you can only see 1 meter. So if you're going to do optical, then your signal can only go up to 1 meter, right? And they also did this on the reef in near Brisbane, and the water looks fantastic. But I don't think they discussed too much about what they found in the sea, in ocean water, right? They talk more about the Charles River and the swimming pool. So the idea here is you would put all this stuff around. You'll deploy all this stuff, right? And you have a map of where these things are. So somebody has to know where the objects are deployed. So you're not actually throwing them from the air. You're probably having one of these Amors going and deploying them at certain location. And you need this map because when you want to do this data hauling, you have to know how to get to the different components. So if you have them deployed like so, right, you have to do a computational geometry kind of calculation to figure out how you would traverse all this stuff to look for all the content, right? So if you're doing a 2D stuff, one of the ways you can do that is you can go around like this. And you can go and sort of like a raster kind of fashion, which is what they do. If you're doing it in 3D, right? So essentially you have to figure out how to go through all this stuff, travel the least amount of distance, and still collect all the data, right? So the problem is you have to first figure out how to get to node number 1, right? And the way they do that is to use the GPS. So you go to the surface, do a GPS lookup of where the first one should be. You have a map of all this stuff where things are, and using when you know where the location is, move towards where you think the first one is, then dive in, right? And then you try to do a spiral pattern. You keep essentially going around till you either see the thing with the camera, because it's a bright yellow object, so you should be able to see it. If you can't see it, till you hear from it, they have beacon LEDs you can look for. So essentially, you have to keep going this till you find this stuff, then get all the range data from the sensor, and then from here to here you have to traverse, right? And you can use the GPS does not work, so you use the magnetometer to figure out how to go from here to here, and then so on and so forth, right? So eventually, and if you do the math, it looks like it'll take a couple of days to go through this entire field, right? Because you need to stay around, get all the data, and then move to the next one, get all the data, move to the next one, data and stuff. So it likely will take you a couple of days. And then at the end, you dump all the data that you have, likely to the Starbug. And Starbug takes it off and goes off to the human, and you start all over again and do this stuff, right? And you would like to do this for days and days. And looks like their main problem would be that this device is not chargeable, right? The sensors are not chargeable, and they have 3 C-cell batteries. So it can last for a few weeks, and after that point, one of them always have to go and pull the stuff out, put new batteries, and then you send it back and stuff. So you would eventually want to do this and get all the data. And you'll see some of these constraints, how it affects them. So you need to be able to go to the first location. You need to do this spiral motion to figure out where things are. And then you need to be able to hover over this stuff, right? So the further you are away from the sensor, right, it's important that you stay within range. If the current is pulling you, right, so if your sensor is right here, and you happen to be here, and you're doing optical reading, right? Optical, essentially, they're using a laser, right? So think of it as your laser pointer kind of thing, right? If you're really far out, and if the wave moves you like a little bit here, right, you cannot read anymore. So you have to be within that short range, unless you're using this way, in which case you'll have to come all the way down, right? The more interesting observations were some of the data they had on precisely how these things radiated, right? They have a lot of discussion on how the hardware and what the limitations are. So they used for the optical, they used that particular sensor, right? What turns out, underwater, blue-green is better color than red, right? Red colors doesn't travel too far. Blue and green travels far out. And turns out LEDs are much better in the red color than blue and green, right? So you're in a position where the water dictates that you have to use a green laser, but the technology is good for red laser, right? So they use that particular green laser, and they use a detector which is really tuned for infrared and red light, right? Which is not exactly close. So their noise ratio was horrible, right? Infrared is essentially a heat signature, and underwater infrared is black. So, and there's an awful mismatch, right? I mean, the LED is sending out green light, and this detector is not designed to capture green light. And hopefully, this will be fixed at some point. It only costs $50 for the optical stuff, which is a lot cheaper if you believe the claim that the acoustic is $3,000 per sensor, right? They also talk about elsewhere that acoustic they had a $20 one, so it's either 20 or 33,000. So it's very expensive. So compared to that, it's fairly cheap, right? And we have these issues, but I think those can be solved eventually. Like having a blue sensor and the blue laser and the collector would be fine. The awful part is, since if you're operating like this, right, the sun tends to be on the top, right? So for here, the sun so if you're communicating from the Amur to the aqua flux, you have to differentiate with sun, which is a lot brighter, right? And similarly, actually, you won't have as much problem coming from. So communication from here to here would be okay because there's not many shining laser lights on the ocean floor. But communication to the Amur would be a problem because you have the sun rays out there, right? And that's an important problem, and that's something any of these sensors would face, because if you're using optical system, you have to worry about other sources. Remember, from the acoustic stuff, you have to worry about ships and all those things. You have to worry about sun, right? So if you go deeper, you'll be fine. But for the shallow depths that you're talking about, sunlight would be a problem, right? And the way they fix that is to put a little green filter here. So this can only see the specific green light that is used by the laser, right? So hopefully there's not enough of them affecting their communication. But you still have that, because the sun is a source with all colors, so you're still facing the sun, and you're trying to work with the sun, right? And they also talked about the other acoustic modems, which was sorely missing from the last paper in terms of what the ranges are and stuff. So one of the better modems is the Hui modem at the top. It has a 5 kilometer range, which is fairly long, right? Very low bits per second, 220 bits per second. Very high energy. It uses 10 watts to run the communication stuff. And I suspect that's the one which costs $3,000, right? So if you want to be able to reach to 5 kilometer at a very low data rate of 220 bits per second, theoretical, not practical, and you're willing to spend 10 watts for transmission, that's a good way to go. There's also another acoustic modem, which is what they use, which I think is $20, right? Which is it can do 480 bits per second. The range is 200 meter, right? Not as much as 5 kilometer. It uses 0.45 watts, sorry. And so the argument is, if you use the aqua calm, right, to do this, if you want to do this traversal for the whole field, the communication time itself would take you 1.3 days, because the amount of data that you have to collect is 6.86 megabyte for all the sensors, right? So it's going to take you a lot longer, which means that makes it a lot harder for you to keep still, because you have to hover over the sensor for that long. So the argument is you should use the optical. If you're doing multi-hop routing, like what we looked in the last class, it'll take you 6.2 megajoules of energy to do the forwarding, right? So regarding the sensors, regarding the hardware, which one of these things would you prefer? The long range one or the short range one, right? And why? Forget about the cost. Assume that it was all given to you for free.
For this, you'd still prefer the short range. You don't need to transmit for 5 kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
And you get more than double the data rate. So if you had the other ones, it would take, 2.6 days or more, almost 3 days.
Yeah. So what are the scenarios under which you'll prefer the longer distance one, the 5 kilometer one? Because that seems like a...
Somewhere where you're way out in the middle of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're actually in deep water, where you can't just send a moving vehicle to collect data.
Okay, so you're in the middle of the ocean, right? And assuming that this is very deep, right? And you have this sensor, and you have this which can talk to 5 kilometer, right? So where do you think the next sensor should be?
A little less than 5 kilometers, probably.
Yeah, but
you want to space them out as far as you can.
Why? So let's say 5 kilometers just for simplicity, right? So why can't I do this? And let's say this is small.
I guess if you're going across, I was thinking because each one costs $3,000.
Yeah, forget about this. No, cost is not an issue, right? So why won't I do this at, let's say, 100 meters? No, so since cost is not a constraint to us, and bitrate, of course, is a problem, right? But it gives you flexibility of going anywhere, right? So one of the things we talked about last class was the waves could move it around and stuff. So if you have the 5 kilometer range, I can leave it here, but even if it drifts off, I can still talk to it, right? So it gives you a lot more flexibility than the 200 meter, where if it goes beyond 200 meters, it can't talk. And again, these are theoretical values, right? And if you do a practical stuff, it'll be a lot smaller, right? And don't worry about the energy cost, don't worry about the cost of these sensors. What other phenomenon would decide, would it matter? Yes?
If you have multiple sensors very close, signals could collide. You have to be careful.
Yeah, so that's one of the problems with our goodness with the acoustic, right? Acoustic, like we talked about, I think in last class was, it's omnidirectional, right? So if you're good acoustic, then you expect it to flow in all directions. In practical sense, you can't do that because, of course, you have the sensor platform, so it may not transmit all the way. But it can flow in any direction, right? Which is good because then I don't have to hover exactly right here. I can hover anywhere else, right? Which is also good that then I can communicate with another sensor here. So if it is 5 kilometers, I can have another sensor here. If they're all within this 5 kilometer range, then I can broadcast and do this stuff, right? In the optical one, it's narrow, right? So let's say it can either go very small or maybe very large like this, right? Which means that they have to hover, right? If you use acoustic, you don't have to hover because you have to hover, but it can be within this range anywhere. But it also means that only one of them can communicate at any time. So if you have a really long 5 kilometer, if you have a technology that can talk up to 5 kilometers, you have to have a way to control that transmission, right? Or else only one can talk within this 5 kilometer radius circle, right? Which may or may not be good. So if you're in the middle of the ocean and all you're trying to do is get an aggregate view of the Pacific Ocean every, let's say, 10 kilometers, this is an excellent way to go. But if you're trying to look at something very close, then it'll degenerate a lot more, right? So, right? Makes sense? So, regardless of course, you have the cost and stuff. So, 3,000 may or may not be of significance to whoever wants to do this stuff, right? So, one of the things is 3,000 looks big, but if you're fitting that to the C-bug, right, the big moving platform, right, and if you can reach that far, the cost of the unit is probably in hundreds of thousands of dollars. The big mobile unit, right? So, from the figures, it looks like they have one C-bug and about 10 of these more. So if you look at so these are the, I don't know if you can see it. Sorry. Huh? Can you see it? It's like on a beach, and they have like on a fence or something. They have each amor kind of sticking out, right? And there's something sticking out. I guess the optical and stuff like that, right? So they seem to have a lot more of the amors than they have of the C-bug, right? So this is likely to be in hundreds of thousands rather than millions, as what the other could be, right? So if you have only one unit that you have, 3,000 is not a big deal because you have something so expensive. But the other constraints still remain, right? And of course, you still have the same issue of waves and all those things that you have to contend. So if you have a longer range, then you tend to pick up noise from a lot longer range. Right? So yeah, the strong point is how they validated this stuff. So they validated this on an Olympic-sized swimming pool, clean water, the sort of the best case you would expect, and Charles River, sort of the realistic case you would see. And clean water, they said, the water is clean enough for you to communicate up to 8 meters. You can't. That's the theoretical limit of what the water would let you do. And in Charles River, the water is so turbid that you can watch up to a meter, right? And so, regardless of what you do, regardless of how you set your sensor, the water is dirty enough that you cannot communicate more than 1 meter, right? And they showed that within a swimming pool, if you use those lenses to narrow the range, right, to increase how far you can go, and you had 2 people holding the sensors underwater with hand, right? So they are precise. They're not hovering over the water. So you put these 2 sensors hold them with the hand. So essentially, I have a laser pointer, and you're holding some piece of paper that I have to control of, kind of thing, right? So in the best case, they could achieve 7-meter transmission. So if there's no issue with hovering, if you're exactly at the point that I want you to be, we can hold each other. Then you actually achieve 7 meters, which is fairly good compared to what the theoretical, what these things can do. So so you can actually hover, technically hover 7 meters above the stuff. So you'll be able to communicate with these units. And the energy consumption that they actually measured was about 1094 nanojoules per bit, which for comparison with the wireless people, they've done 760 nanojoules per bit. So energy is very good. So you can do a fairly decent energy-wise. Of course, it's slower than what you can do on the terrestrial side. But if you can hold them together, you can go up to 7 meters, right? Which is good. But I think it's a good number, right? 7 meters, like 20 some odd feet, right? Which is what, from the ground till up sort of till here, I would guess, right? This building, I would think, is like a 10-foot ceiling, right? Actually, I don't know how big the first floor is. So let's assume from here to the roof, right? So you can hover pretty much that far. Right? Actually, that should read acoustic sensors, right? So the problem with the acoustic sensor, the title is acoustic sensor, not optical sensor, right? The problem with the acoustic sensor is acoustic sensor essentially you have a microphone and a speaker, right? The one which creates a noise is a speaker. The one which receive it is a microphone. So they have to figure out some way to put them underwater. And some of the sensors that they could buy are all designed for outside the water, right? So they did find this one sensor which is cheap enough, right? $20, right? And they had to put it underwater. And essentially, you have to couple it with the water, so you don't create a space between the water and the microphone and the receiver. So they had to use hot glue to put it on top of this stuff. I don't know what hot glue is, but it seems to work, right? So if you do that, then they're able to communicate between these stuff. And that's something that you'll have to worry about because these things light goes through a lot more stuff than audio stuff. You need to make sure that there's no thing. So they did a couple of studies in the Charles River, right? And essentially these are so they're not sending data yet. They're trying to send some radio signals and see how far it can go, right? So the first set of experiments they did was they held it underwater for 30 to 40 centimeters, and they sent a radio pulse, and see how far else you can receive it without visually looking bad, right? So they sent a square pulse, which looks awful when I draw it. So essentially, you're sending a square pulse, and you try to move the detector as far away from the sensor and see how the pulse looks like. So it turns out that if you're 5.8 meters away, you can still see the things as square, right? If you go further than that, it looks sort of, let's say, like this, right? So the idea here is it hasn't disintegrated enough at this point, but if you go further, it disintegrates, so you can't really read them. And so they did a pulse position modulation to transmit some data, preliminary numbers, and I don't think it's megabits per second. I think it's 41 bits per second, right? Apology for the number. I don't think they're doing that much.
So it's like millibits per second.
No, I think it's bits per second. So they were able to do 41 bits per second up to 15 meters, right? So this is again very preliminary because you're not actually doing any protocol kind of things. But at the data layer, you can send that many bits of information up to 15 meters. So you're able to go much further inside Charles River, where you can't even go past 1 meter because of the way the water is, right? So that may or may not affect what they were saying. One of the argument was you don't have to use acoustic because acoustic has all these problems. Optical is much better, and clearly it's much better when you're on a clear set of water, like a swimming pool or the coral reefs where the water looks fantastic. But if you're going to do this under in charge of kind of situations, right, acoustic still holds a lot of important. It's still preferable, right? And more details about how they do the data gathering. So again, you have to go. First, you have to use the GPS to figure out where you want to go. First, find first sensor, right, and then use it. Then you kind of do a spiral motion, and you look for the stuff. And they give bits and pieces of how difficult that location is, because what you're trying to do is you have the sensor somewhere hidden, and you are like floating in water. You have to go right on top of the other one, right? So you have to first locate where this thing is. So either you locate it by using visual means, in which case you have to have a camera which is looking for a yellow object, right? And it's more challenging because underwater you can't see the color as well, and the object may not look the way you expect underwater, but somehow you see this stuff, right? Or you use LED to beacon to it, and then you have to go towards it, right? Which may mean that you have to search for this stuff for a while, going in a circular spiral pattern. Eventually you find it, and you eventually go near it, and you go top of it, right? So that's what you do for the first one. They used in the Starbug, it used a 5 hertz camera, which means that every second is capturing 5 images, and you're trying to see where this yellow object is, right? And it works reasonably well if you know what is yellow, right? And if you watched any of the Discovery Channel kind of thing, when you go underwater, the colors begin to disappear because different lights goes to different depth, right? Red is the first one to go, and then blue and green, and so on and so forth. So whatever color you're looking for depends on different levels. It looks differently. So the Starbug works if it's not too deep. If it's too deep, then the color won't work. It also has a white LED you can use to figure out where things are. And I suspect that component itself is very hard, because finding out where this thing is and swimming towards it may take a while. And then once you figure out where these things are, you have to do a hover, right? And again, Starbug uses a camera. So it has a camera which is looking down on these things. I don't think they have experience with this stuff, but essentially the idea is you'll use that to figure out how far away you moved, and then use these thrusters to position yourself, right? So you have the water, you're inside the water, and the water is like flowing. There's like all kind of tides and stuff, and you have this Starbug right here, and has a camera pointing down here, right? And this yellow object is right here. So you're trying to use that to see how far you moved, and then try to get back to the stuff.
Are you talking about the Starbug or the Amor?
Starbug. Okay. Starbug has the camera, right? But I don't think they actually done this yet. Use Starbug to use the camera to float around, to detect these things, right? They talk about what would need. So one of the problems I had with this paper was they talk about it, but you have to read like 4 times to actually know that they are talking about how you could do that rather than how they actually done it, right? Did people get the sense that they're kind of intentionally vague, where you can read it either way? So only the Starbug can do that, because only Starbug has a camera, so only it can see the stuff. And Starbug has a camera, one pointing down and one pointing forward, right? Which they also claim that it's not that useful because it's hugging the cliff, the coral reef bottom. So even though it can look out, it can't really see much because it's actually inside the reefs, right? So this is not that useful, but they can use this to see exactly where they are and keep themselves. And the Amor uses the beaconing. So you remember that this little rod here, and then there's a LED on top. Amor uses that to figure out where to hover. So they describe the exactly precise protocol that they used. Every packet has a 1 byte guard bit at the front. So you have to notice that to know there's a data transfer. So essentially these things come over, they come on top of it, they send a signal to wake this up. So this unit sleeps for the most part and only listens to the optical component every so often, right? And these things have to hover up there, wait on top of it, send a signal to say wake up and do the stuff, because you have more energy here than up here. So these things sleep for the most part. You come up and say, you wake up, and then you do the data transfer, right? And you want to avoid having these things send more than the data that they captured. So they basically send the data with very little headers and stuff. It has 1 byte of header and the data. So you send 239 byte package with 1 byte of header. Small packets, but these are optically being shot as compared to the acoustics. These are larger packets. So you hover around, get all the data. And then you also use the time to synchronize your clock, right? So you assume that the clock here is synchronized, and you assume the clock here is drifting. So you come over here, and the first thing you do is synchronize both these clocks, right? So how would you correlate the data between this sensor and this sensor? So you would like a global synchronization, right? Because you are looking at a global phenomenon, not what the sensors are doing. So if you can synchronize these clocks, right? How would the next sensor be synchronized? If you assume like this way, right? You sense this, you synchronize this one first, right? Then you synchronize this one. Then you synchronize this one to the Starbug or Amor's clock, right? And then you sense this, the 4 and 5 and 6 and so on, right? There's a certain level of drift on the Amor clock too, right? So you're not doing a global synchronization. You're synchronizing on these patterns, right? They do a simple, the stuff that we saw earlier on how to synchronize. So when you first connect, you see what the time is on here, you see what the time is here, and then you try to do the average, do a little calculation to figure out what this time would have been when you captured it, right? And then you go on to another one. So you're kind of changing the data time as you move along based on the synchronized whatever value you have up here and what the value is here. And then you're doing this to the different ones, right? So the data that you collect has a certain level of error involved, error inherent, both in terms of when you did this, when you last did the synchronization by this Amor thing, and how well the clock shifts within Amor. Does that make sense? Because you're not doing a global synchronization because that's more expensive. So you're trying to do this stuff. So if this Amor comes every month or so, right, then the system will break down, right? Because you're running for a whole month with no data synchronization. So I know that when I left you last time, your clock should have been what my clock was. When I come back after a month, your clock has drifted by hour, right? Then I have to assume that every data you collected was linearly kind of changed from the clock, that value that you saw, right? And then I do this for every different sensor, right? You have to account for the time it takes to all this stuff. So the timing it's not, I don't think it's precise enough. It may be precise enough for what they're doing here, but may not be precise for other stuff they're trying to do, because the synchronization happens slowly, because the Amors do not go from here to here in 0 cost time, because it has to go search and go there and do this stuff. But that's all they could do because of the nature of how these things are working, right? So it will be nice in that sense to do this 5-kilometer range acoustic thing, right? Then you can probably have a beacon here which sends out this pulse every so often. You're not trying to do anything else except this beaconing. So every so often, you tell everyone, synchronize your clock to myself. They haven't looked at that yet, right? So they have lots of challenges, and the nice thing I like about the paper is they actually have done this, or at least thought about it enough to give a good argument, right? So the summary of both this paper and the last paper is, underwater communication is hard, right? I mean, like I mentioned, one of the things is underwater sensing has a lot of potential, especially if you're trying to get into this as a grad student and stuff. Essentially because most of the underwater world is unknown to us, there's a lot of opportunity. People want to learn how these things operate. So there are a lot of real challenges that need to be solved from the science perspective, right? But from a technical perspective, how to communicate with these devices is the hardest part, right? So you can either use this acoustic stuff, which for the most part is slow, right? It has other characteristics, but it's very slow. So it has higher range depending on what technology we use. We can go up to 5 kilometers. And it's omnidirectional, so you can communicate with all these devices in one swoop, which means that your protocols can be designed where I can talk to a whole bunch of sensors all at once, right? And it's higher cost and lower data rate, right? But the catch is it may need multiple hops, and that can slow these things down, right? Optical, it can have higher bandwidth if you can get somebody to optically link with you, right? So you can't optically communicate from the sensor back to the base station. So you're forced to have these mobile nodes communicate with you. You're forced to be on within range. You're forced to look directly into the stuff, right? So what prevents the optical stuff from having a longer range?
The fact that the water doesn't transmit.
Yeah, but how do you solve that? You can crank up the power, right? Basically, you've seen science fiction movies, right? So essentially, you're shooting a very powerful laser through the water, right? You can achieve lot higher range by having these things at a very high power. If you're a fish, you don't probably want to be in the middle of these communications. But like 700 milliwatts sounds like a fairly big number, right? Because I think the laser pointers are in milliwatt, the ones you see for this milliwatt, right? So I don't know how much you need to blind people and stuff. But I think 700 milliwatt is powerful enough that you don't want to be looking at the laser if you're swimming underwater, right? And that's the thing which restricts them. Of course, you can communicate if you have a lot of battery, but then you're probably slicing all the fish which are swimming through the path, right? Which is not a good way. So you have lower range, mostly because you have the other constraints too, that you want to be safe to the environment that you're watching. It's directional by nature, right? If you don't make it directional, then the range is smaller. If you make it directionally, the range can be larger. It's lower cost because LEDs are fairly lower cost and higher data rate, right? And they haven't talked anything at all about what happens when you do in real water, right? So I won't want to put any of the sensors inside Charles River, which I never seen underwater, but from the top, it doesn't look that inviting, right? So if you're going to put these things underwater, they may degrade in different fashion where one may be preferable to the other, right? To me, it sounds like the optical would degrade faster than the acoustic in that kind of scenarios. The depth of operation issues, they didn't talk about. It seems like if you're underwater, very at a larger depth, then the light will probably travel further out than it did when you have sun to deal with, right? Even though you may introduce other issues that they haven't really worked about. And data hauling is good, but does data hauling really work if you're doing a 3D sensing? Remember the notion of having these kind of sensing look in the whole thing, right? How would you do the data gathering in that scenario, right? So now you have to come up with a 3D algorithm, not a 2D raster, but a 3D raster which covers all this area. Now there's a proportionately much larger sensing for the same 2D area, right? Because you have to go this level, this level, this level kind of thing, right? It also seems like mobility with these things hanging around is a disaster waiting to happen, because you have all these sensor cables going around, and to hover these things around those things could be a potential problem, right? So it's not clear to me, at least, how you would do this in a 3D sensing scenario. If you have all this stuff, how do you hover over these things to collect all the data without having to worry about all these sensor cables and stuff, right? Can you think of another way to solve this problem, to solve the communication problem?
One thing I was thinking is, since you do a wire in between them, you can have wired communication up to the top one, and then only can basically convert the 3D space back to 2D.
Oh, you mean send all the data back to here?
Yeah, since you do have a cable running in between them, you should be able to put a wire in that cable.
Okay.
And just use wired communication to the top, and then aggregate the data and send it from there.
That's an excellent observation, right? So essentially, you kind of convert all this and this base station by using this cable as the communication mechanism, right? So far we looked at the optical and wireless, right? Can you think of another mechanism for communication? I think which sort of along the lines that you were talking about, right?
Wire communication, but have a very limited use for this.
Yeah. I was thinking, like, wouldn't it be nice to just have like a wire sticking out? And you're doing hovering anyway, right? If optically you're doing hovering anyway. And I mean, they have these kind of like things sticking out.
I was thinking that earlier too, like what keeps it from just going down and hovering 1 foot away or just attaching to that pole to get the data that way?
Yeah, I think hovering 1 feet away may not be possible. I mean, depending on how they put it. I mean, the pictures they have is on a clear bed of, there's no coral reef. It's like a sandy bottom with nothing in it, right? But if you're doing it a real coral reef, then hopefully these would be in, there could be like some kind of a rock here or something, right? Even though I don't think you really could have, because you need to have the line of sight to get you out, right? But you could think of like leaving a strand of wire kind of floating in the water with like sort of like a little balloon or something, right, to keep it floating up kind of thing. Then you can kind of attach to it and then do all the communication, right? Because they're awfully close. I mean, you can do that with acoustic, because your range is higher. But in this case, you're awfully closer. You're also hovering on top of this, right? Seems like that would make this problem all go away, right? I mean, there may be other issues because now you have this like fishing rods kind of thing, fishing tackles kind of thing floating around.
You also have to worry about keeping everything watertight then through this, because if you're going to use electronic communications through the wire, unless you're using fiber optics, I guess.
But whatever you do here could be done here, right?
Well, because that way they were all attached initially outside the water in theory.
Oh, okay. So
this way you got to have some kind of watertight method of attaching yourself to the wire.
But the potential payoff could be much higher, right? I mean, if you're using a copper wire, then you're not talking in bits per second. You can potentially do a lot more, right? Yeah, I don't know how you do that, but seems like there's other mechanisms that having people have looked at.
Space, you could probably get water out of a little compartment to attach a wire.
Yeah. Yeah, or even like a fiber optic. I mean, this could be a fiber optic cable, right? And then you have to attach it, but it still is a lot simpler, seems like, than to hover on top of it, because you have to hover on top of it for the entire duration of the communication, right? So I need to have all the mechanics to keep it at the same sort of looking down on the aqua flux, right? But if I can have like some kind of a cable, optic or something, and there would be issues of how do I attach it without electrocuting everything around it kind of thing. But seems like that would be a simpler problem, right? So there's still maybe space of doing this stuff, but these are the stuff that people have looked at so far, right? And this is nice because at least they actually went into the water, which is one of the complaints from the last class, right? So looking back, right? So again, we have looked at two different systems. One is ZebraNet, and the other one is this, right? ZebraNet is about mobility. You're tying it to a zebra, letting it run, or it runs on where it wants to go. And this is, you have these sensors going around, right? Is there something we can learn from one to the other, right? And I didn't mention this. I didn't know about this back then. Turns out in the ZebraNet, which they didn't talk about in the paper at all, zebras don't really like these things on their collar, right? And you can't blame them because the problem is you can't leave it loose, right? If it's loose, then they may get stuck on it, right? You don't want like if it's a big collar, right? Then if they go under brush or something, they can have their neck tied to get stuck somewhere. It's not a good move if your zebras are killed because of your sensing mechanism, right? So you have to have it tight enough that nothing can really go in, right? And zebras apparently don't like things choking them. So after a day or so, they knock out the solar panels which go first, because if you remember the picture, there's a belt with the solar panels kind of stuck to them, right? So somehow they get the solar panels off, and then the belt they can't get it up. So the belt stays for however long they want it, but the solar panels are all knocked off, and right. So they didn't talk about it in the paper at all, but it seems like, yeah.
It seems like the other thing is that the solar panels are shiny, and if you're running from a predator, you don't want a big shiny solar panel.
They didn't talk about that at all, but I guess that in this case it wouldn't have been a problem because it's gone very soon, right?
Yeah.
And that's excellent observation, right? So if you take this to underwater, right, you have to. So I've seen people whales and stuff. They put a sensor on the whale to figure out how far they go and stuff, right? Nice thing about whales is they have to come back up for air, so they can't stay inside forever. So it seems like they what the thing, right? They get a harpoon or something, put it on the whale. It goes under, right? And then it detaches and then comes out at some point, right? So it's not hooked to it, right? But if you were to do the ZebraNet model here and you have like a thing floating from the fish when they're going around, right? It's probably death knell for it because it will get entangled in the stuff, right? Yeah, and that's the part with the ZebraNet. But can we use, so instead of doing all this stuff, right? Can we think of how you would use some other animals to collect the data, right? Does that make sense to have like a fish or dolphin or something would you try to do that? Would you put a sensor on top of a dolphin and let it do the job for you? You're saying no.
Not in this scenario. I mean, you could, in theory, probably not actually practically take like the scenario that's right behind you where you've got the acoustic sensors in a large area you're trying to cover, and you can, in theory, do it there, but in a reef, it makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. So you would do it if you don't mind it.
I don't think it would work that well even there. But.
So it also includes issues which, as computer scientists, we rarely think about it, right? For example, like zebras, like you pointed out, shiny objects may get them killed, right? You have to worry about the stuff here too, right? Depending on what they're doing, you don't want to kill the animals which are part of this study, right? Actually, I don't think any zebras died. I think they just destroyed the solar panels and they were fine, right? But the notion of hovering over air, like I mentioned in last class, is apparently very hard. I mean, that's something that they really would like to happen, especially when you have disaster recovery and stuff. If you can fly something on top of Katrina, especially Katrina kind of scenarios, right? It's a lot preferable to run these unmanned stuff flying over the things. It's easy to fly like a thing which, like an airplane kind of thing, right? Like a drone flying over this area, and those tend to go faster, so you don't get as much coverage. So you would like to do this hovering that you can do underwater, right? And turns out underwater is a lot easier because of the way the buoyancy works. And over air, it's a lot harder because you probably may know from Air Force kind of perspective, right? But they said it's very hard to fly these things, right? It doesn't scale down very well. You're not able to control it very well. So it works if you have something sort of like what you see on the football game kind of thing, like the big blimp. They're a lot easy to control because they're very big, they're more stable. But it's not very practical to fly something like that humongous. So some of the stuff that you can do underwater may not be able to do above water. So, and I'm not too sure about the animal perspective either. Even zebra sounds awful if you think about it, but fish, I don't think you want to strap things on it, but it changes how they swim too. So you don't want the fish to swim slower because they are doing this sensing for you, right? So essentially, but that kind of covers all the system. So for the midterm, we'll cover all these concepts, right? So far, like if you look at the wrap up of what we covered so far, if you looked at the book and we saw a lot of the traditional way of how people define sensor networks. You talk about scalability, energy conservation, small size, cost, and so on and so forth. And we looked at a number of different scenarios. And I don't think any of the scenarios really worried about scalability yet, because scalability is not something you have to worry about till you make these things work. If your range you can communicate is like meter and so on and so forth, you're not so worried about scalability at this point, right? And these scenarios cover the sort of the active areas people are working on. So the issue of habitat monitoring, the Duck Island experiment where we looked at, the main thing they were worried about is longevity, right? You want to keep it for 9 months or so. And turns out The longevity does not, the main constraint is